vision, we have made our decision to show the Father's love with great power from above.
We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light.
We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark.
We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet.
We are
Mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand.
Let us reach this generation, every tribe and every nation, for we've overcome the world by the blood of Christ the Lamb.
We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light.
We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark.
We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet.
We are
Mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. Lord our God is a sword and
the
shield.
Lord our God,
Fight our battles,
sword and shield.
Lord our God is a sword and
The
shield.
Lord our God, power,
Lord our God is a sword and
the rock of
We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light.
We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark.
We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet.
We are
Mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. Lord our God is a sword and
the
shield.
Lord our God, is a sword and shield.
Lord our God is a sword
The
and shield.
Lord our God, is a mighty tower,
Lord our God is a sword and
the
shield.
rock of ages.
We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light.
We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark.
We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet.
We are
Mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We too are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet.
we are
Mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. We are mighty.
Okay, good morning, everyone. How many college football fans are there here? Did you make it through yesterday? My heart is still going. There were more close games yesterday than I've seen in a long time, so we'll see what the NFL brings us today. Announcements, and then I will hand it over to Dave Eskoff. 2 more weeks on our Unlikely Heroes study here at Mid-Pointe. Dave Eskoff is talking about Jonathan, and then Pastor Tiemann wraps it up next week with Onesimus, somebody we probably haven't talked a lot about over the years, but he will go ahead and close out our series, and then we begin a new series, and that is one of the most important series. We've done it probably in the last 27 years. We have done a variety of the combination of studying the Bible and in diving into how it was formed, its reliability. You can really trust what the Bible says today, that it's historically accurate, all of those things, and its overall message. That is one of the most important studies we've done here at Emmanuel over the last 20, 25 years, and we're going to do it again, 7 weeks here at Mid-Pointe here in the Commons. So October 24th begins a whole new series. We also have other Bible studies going on at that time. We have down in the music room will be Don't Give the Enemy a Seat at the Table by Terry Nielsen is going to lead this. And it is a video-based study on Psalm 23 about battling the attacks of Satan in the mindset, the thinking of the Christian. And then Laura Wright's Bible study will continue up in the art room. And then Ray Monroe, who's been leading Bible studies here at Emmanuel for the past few years, on and off, is going to do a more in-depth study. Questions, what does God say about, and going to try to understand what God has to say through his word about the various issues that we wrestle with as Christians. And you can read about that there in the explanation. And then a new member God Connects class will begin. This is all October 24th, 2 weeks from today. Okay? Small groups, once again, the material sign-up is over. Everybody's got their small groups. If you are not part of a small group and you want to get a participant guide, you can do that. You can follow along. Some people are going to be doing that online. You can follow along with the participant guide with Pastor Tieman's series for the 7 weeks. If you are a leader or you haven't gotten your participant guide, Julie is in the back there, and after Mid-Pointe is over, and then also after the 10:30 service, you can pick up those materials. And last but not least, this is our mistake for the week. We're not going to have any audio issues, but on the back, I totally forgot the QR code this week. Mike Dennis said, hey, I want to sign in for Mid-Pointe. Well, the QR code is gone. Redid the back of the bulletin for the new Bible studies coming up and dropped the QR code. So guess what? Don't worry about trying to sign in today. We take a rough attendance, and we'll get that straightened out next week. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dave Eskoff. You've helped me welcome him.
Good morning. Am I on? Well, we're back. So looking forward to doing today's talk on Mid-Pointe. Thanks for all coming. I'd like to see, I see a lot of familiar faces, but everyone has a mask on, so I can't really tell. But welcome those who are here and welcome those who are watching online. So today's talk is on the story of Jonathan, but really today's talk is really about talking about, I've got the clicker, I'm pushing this button. It's not working really good, but I think I've opened every garage door in Crystal Lake. But so I'm going to start with really the key takeaway right out of the gate. And this is the thing that we're really going to build on, which is following God's plan versus our own is the foundation for both pleasing and glorifying God. And the story of Jonathan really sort of accentuates that point. But as we talk you through, or as I take you through this, I mean, there's going to be many biblical points that really point to this. And, you know, ultimately, at the end, whoops, the crazy clicker. This is going to be the challenge. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some context that gets us up to the book of Jonathan, or actually the story of Jonathan. It's not the book of Jonathan, so that you can better appreciate it. You know, not only where is it at in the Bible, but sort of the bigger context of following God's plan versus our own. We're going to get into the story of Jonathan, and then, but most of all, I want to save some time here at the end, which is probably the most important piece of, you know, so what, right? I mean, the whole notion of following God's plan versus our own, it's very easy to say, but extremely difficult to do. I mean, I don't know about you, but it's one of those things that's a little bit abstract where you say, okay, well, following God's, you know, all you got to do in life will be good is follow God's plan. But it's also a big challenge to know exactly what that plan is for us. So to start with, so the context, and I always like to start with really the macro, and because if you dive right into the story, it has no real sort of meaning unless you sort of build it up, you know, all the story around it and all the context around it. And the start of this right now, I just want to go back to the Garden of Eden, right? I mean, when God created, you know, the heavens and the earth and the Garden of Eden and paradise, and had Adam and Eve in paradise. And at that point, God had a plan for Adam and Eve. And that plan was to follow God's instructions. And they pretty much had full reign of the Garden of Eden, and they were forbidden to do one thing and one thing only, which was eat from the tree of knowledge, and they ate from the tree of knowledge, which was disobedient to God because ultimately Adam and Eve, it wasn't good enough to have perfection. They wanted perfection and equality to God. And what we learned from this, not following God's plan, when we don't follow God's plan, there's judgment. And judgment was passed, and the judgment that was passed was that both Adam and Eve and man essentially got knocked out of paradise because of their sin. And essentially the reason why they got knocked out of there is that, judgment is passed every time we commit sin. And as a result, the whole rest of the Bible is really sort of torn around sort of God reconciling man back to him. Because God not only judges sin, but he's also a very forgiving God. So the manner in which God would reconcile man back to him and ultimately open up the gates of paradise, open up the gates of heaven, was the deliverance of a Messiah. And this is like, in what I'm saying here, this is like pre-Jew, pre-Gentile, or pre-Christian. So this pertains to all mankind, right? That all mankind would be reconciled back to God through the coming of a Messiah. Now, it just so happens that the Jewish people's version of what a Messiah is would be a king that would rule here on earth and bring everlasting peace to the nation of Israel. That's the Jewish people's version of it. And to sort of accentuate their version of it, all we have to do is fast forward to the time of Jesus, to the time of his ministry, where it was becoming more and more apparent within those 3 years that Jesus Christ was in fact this earthly king that the Jewish people were waiting for, that was going to bring everlasting peace to the nation of Israel. But as we know, is Jesus entered on Sunday, on Palm Sunday, where this is towards the end of his ministry, and there was peak excitement by the Jewish people because they thought this was the guy. 5 days later, as we know, Jesus Christ is crucified, dies on the cross, and that peak excitement went to, peak disappointment by the Jewish people. It was like the worst sugar high ever. And when Jesus Christ was on the cross, there's a charge, everyone who's on the cross, there's a charge or a plaque that sits right above the people who are on the cross. And the plaque that existed on Jesus Christ's cross was, Jesus Christ, King of the Jews, right? So it was not only the charge, but it was sort of a way to mock, Jesus Christ in terms of, and really sort of mock the Jewish people and saying, hey, this is your king? So naturally, this disappointment really, sort of accentuates the point that the Jewish people's version of who the Messiah would be a king here on earth. But as we know, to sort of, end sort of the context of this piece, God's plan for the Messiah was a heavenly king. Man's plan, i.e. the Jewish people's plan, was an earthly king. So that sort of sets up that piece. But this sort of flows into the story that we're, the more context in terms of leading up to the story of Jonathan. And that is sort of giving a little bit of context in terms of where we're at in the Bible. So as we know, the Jewish people were enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. And God sent Moses to deliver the Jewish people from bondage and take them out of Egypt, which happened, right? He gets, Moses leads the people out of Egypt and out of bondage and out of slavery. Well, in the meantime, right after that happened, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, and on Mount Sinai, God writes the 10 Commandments and the laws that the Jewish people would follow, the 613 laws. And essentially, the 10 Commandments and the laws that the Jewish people would follow was, in essence, God's plan for the Jewish people in terms of how they would live, right? And it's this plan that he expected the Jewish people to live by, and not by living by that, there would be judgment. So now we've got the Jewish people after Moses received the commandments, after Moses received the laws, the Jewish people are wandering in the desert for 40 years, but they finally make it to the promised land, right? And in the promised land, in the start of the promised land, where we're going to go here next, the manner in which God governed over the Jewish people was, in essence, a theocracy, right? Where God is the leader, and there was judges, priests, prophets, over the Jewish people. And the theocracy notion, again, really kind of comes from the first commandment, that God passed on to Moses, and that there would be one God and one God only, and he wanted the Jewish people to follow that one God and not worship any other gods, any other human beings. That was it, right? So again, the fancy term for this is a theocracy, but in essence, all of the theocracy it means is that God is the sole ruler over the people. Now, when you look at this, God, though, got leverage. He had his lieutenants, the judges, priests, and prophets, that in essence would help carry out God's laws and commandments, right? Judges are just simply, as it says, those leaders who were responsible for ensuring that the Jewish people were following the laws and the commandments of God. You have the priests who were over the sacrificial system, right? Because God is a forgiving God, the manner in which the Jewish people for their sin would gain forgiveness was through sacrifices. And God had a very prescriptive plan in terms of how sacrifices were to be done. It was done by priests who were part of the tribe of Levite. But as we'll see, only the priest and the priest only could perform sacrifices, and only the priest and the priest only had to perform sacrifices specifically the way that God had outlined in his laws. And then you had prophets, and the prophets were there to help explain God's plan for the Jewish people, not only in the present, but in the future. Again, so it's not as though the Jewish people didn't have a way to know what God's plan was or to follow God's plan. From the commandments and the laws, there's prophets that help guide the Jewish people in terms of making sure that they followed along on God's plan all the way through. So we are someplace now, and I got to get my head right. So here we are now. So now we're in the Promised Land, and in the Promised Land, in the first 350 years of the Promised Land, this was sort of what the background of what was happening. Okay, so out of Egypt, in the Promised Land, first 300, with a governance structure that God had laid out. In the first 350 years, the Jewish people ran through this cycle. And actually, John talked about this a few weeks ago, so this is sort of a build on to where John was going, which is the fact that what was happening with the Jewish people when they were finally in the Promised Land is they were sinning. And the most egregious sin that the Jewish people were committing was apostasy, which is a fancy term for turning away from religion, but most specifically turning away from God. And again, with sin, essentially the people were violating the first two commandments, the most important commandments, following one God and worshiping that one God. The people were egregiously sinning against God, against the religion. So with sin, as I said, comes judgment. And the type of judgment that God passed on the people of Israel when they sinned in this fashion was they turned the enemies of surrounding nations on Israel to attack them, and attack them up to the point of total destruction. So it was a total mess, because God didn't want destruction, but judgment was being passed. Well, the way that God made sure that this was going to be fine and that he kept the Jewish people safe, and he's a forgiving God, he brought in a judge, or he would appoint a judge. And that judge was responsible, again, for not only assuring that the people got more reconciled to his laws and his commandments, but to assemble armies against the enemies that were coming against the Jewish people and fend off those enemies and bring us back to peace. Now, I've got equal circles here. And the cycle repeated itself 12 times over and over and over again. And I've got equal circles where I've got peace equal to sin equal to the time where there was attack, and there was a time where gods were appointed. But the fact of the matter, the time that the Jewish people were living in peace was a very, very small time. And the time that they were living not in peace was really 99% of the time. So practically speaking, it was really a horrible way for the Jewish people to live, and not a way that was really sustainable. So finally, after 350 years of this cycle repeating itself over and over again, and the Jewish people feeling really uncomfortable, practically speaking, they said, we can't live this way anymore. So as I get ready to get into the book of Samuel where Jonathan is at. We will be in 1 Samuel chapters 8 through 23, and I'm going to read every single word to you here in a few minutes. So I'm not going to do that, but bookmark that because I will hit on a number of different verses. And the first verse here is, again, after 350 years of this, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 19 and 20, the Israel leaders came to Samuel and said, hey, we're fed up. We want a king over us. Then we will be like all other nations with a king to lead us and fight our battles. Right, again, the Jewish people's notion of peace and of a coming Messiah would be a king that would be here on earth and that would bring everlasting peace to the Jewish people. So here's really the first example in the Bible where this is really played out, and it happens right here, right at the end of the 350-year period of Judges. So now, sort of setting up the story of Jonathan, there's four main characters, right? And I'm going to give you these four characters sort of in order of appearance, and then we're going to go deeper into the story, through each of these from each of these characters. So Samuel was the last judge out of the 350 years. He was the final of the 12 judges, I believe. He was definitely the final judge, and also would be the messenger to transition from judges to kings that God would appoint. Saul would become the first king of Israel, and then Jonathan is the son of Saul, who was the first prince of Israel, and then David would ultimately become the second king, but this is King David, right? But this is the prequel. This story here is the prequel to King David and how he ultimately became king. And Jonathan and David, as we'll learn here in a few minutes, were very close friends. So starting here with the story again, so the leaders of the Israelites came to Samuel, and again, they had it. They wanted a king. And when they shared this message to Samuel, it was like, hey, we can't live this way any longer. We want a king. This judges thing isn't working. Well, right off the bat, Samuel took this personally. He's like, well, have I not done a good job for you? And so Samuel takes this to God and says, God, leaders of Israel are coming to me and saying, hey, this judge thing isn't working. I'm not adequate. And God turns to Samuel and does the it's not you, it's me thing. I think we got that all on Seinfeld. He does, it's not you, it's me. Actually, what God says to Samuel, it's like, no, you think you're offended? This isn't about you. They're offending me. They're turning on me, right? That this is the setup that I had. They want a king. They want to turn the theocracy into a monarchy, which I have here on the slide, and have kings be equal to God. This is not good, right? So if we hit 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7, God's response to this request for a king is, it's not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. So God says to Samuel, again, and God had an affection for Samuel. God had an affection for Samuel probably that was equal to the affection that God had for Moses. And he says, be careful what you wish for. I'm going to give them a king, but you let them know that this is a mistake, right? And they're going to regret this decision about wanting a king and not following me the way that I had commanded, this whole structure would work. Now, to keep something in mind is that, yes, God would give the Israelites a king, and kings would, have authority, but in God's eyes, he wasn't giving up any of his power, and he wasn't giving up any of his expectations in terms of following the laws and the commandments that he laid out for the people. But he was going to give them a king and let them learn for themselves, so to speak. So then, where we go from here, not quite there. No, there. No? Yes. No. Here's where we're at. This is going to be like I said, this is the toughest part of this talk. So now Saul enters the picture. So God sends Samuel out and uses Samuel as the guy who's going to transition from judges to kings. And God says, okay, the first king that you're going to appoint, and I want you to appoint Saul as the first king, right? So now Samuel goes and approaches Saul, and I don't know if you know the Ed McMahon where the $1 million sweepstakes where he shows up at someone's door and says, you just won $1 million, and people are like, oh, I can't believe this. Well, this is very similar. It's not like Saul has been sort of planning to become king, right? I mean, all his life. I mean, this came as a shock to Saul that, hey, you are going to be the first king. And then also the responsibility of a kingship, again, is to bring everlasting peace to the nation of Israel. That's a heavy load that, that any king would have to take on. Now, the thing about Saul is just to know his characteristics. Saul had all the looks and appearances of a king. He was tall, he was handsome, he was strong. On the outside looking in, it's like, yeah, I could see why he will become king because he's got all the appearances, all the outwardly appearances. However, the problem with Saul is that inwardly, he was a terribly insecure person. He was very insecure, he was very selfish, and he was a coward, right? So all traits that ultimately would not be pleasing to God and would actually get, the Jewish people in trouble and, so to speak, again, some of the be careful what you wish for that God had said in terms of bringing on a king. So in doing the kingship, again, bringing everlasting peace to the nation of Israel, when Saul was anointed king, there was an attack on Israel by the Ammonites, and he wins that first battle. So he's off to a really good start in terms of fighting off the enemies in bringing peace. But then comes the Philistines, right? The Philistines come in and attack Israel, and there's thousands of Philistines, thousands of them. They've far outnumbered the number of troops that Saul's army had. And as the Philistines were bearing down on Israel, there became, Saul was panicking, right? I mean, there's no way that he was going to be able to fend them off, at least in his mind. So Samuel tells Saul, hey, what you need to do, go hide out in a cave here for 7 days, right? I want you to hide out in a cave. I'm going to come back on the 7th day, and we're going to we're going to do 2 peace offerings, sacrifices to God. And with those sacrifices, these peace offerings to God, God will fight off the Philistines. So Samuel goes, he hides out in this cave, and 7 days is a long time, right? Just sort of to sit there and as the Philistines are coming in and they're bearing down on him, the tension went up. In 7 days, as the clock is ticking, it's a long time, and he didn't have anything to sort of, keep his mind off things. I mean, he couldn't stream Netflix videos. He didn't have the ability to do any of that. So he was becoming increasingly anxious as he was getting to the 7th day. So the 7th day comes, Samuel's not back. It's right early in the 7th day. What does Saul does? He offers up the sacrifices on his own. Just as he offers up the sacrifices, Samuel shows up here later in the day on the 7th day and says, hey, Saul, how's it going? And Saul says, hey, it's going great. I just did the sacrifices. Samuel said, what the heck did you do? I told you I would come back with a priest and we would do the offerings to God in that fashion. You've completely disobeyed what I shared, and ultimately you disobeyed God's commands, and you disobeyed you messed up the whole sacrificial system here. You messed up the whole priesthood of this, and that's 100% against God's plans, God's laws. You've sinned egregiously. And there was ultimately a second instance where Saul wasn't following God's command for him and God's plan for him, where the Amalekites came in and attacked Israel, and God said, hey, I want you to destroy all of the people of that tribe, including their livestock. He didn't do that, and ultimately Samuel came in and killed off the king and killed off the last of the Amalekites. And again, Samuel was like, hey, you've disobeyed once again. So 2 big strikes against Saul. And that sort of leads us to, 1 Samuel chapters 13 and 14. And the judgment that was passed. Whoops, it's not, I apologize. So let me read this to you. So again, with disobedience and not following God's plan, there's judgment. And if you turn again to 1 Samuel 13 through 14, 1 Samuel chapter 13, verses 13 through 14, it reads as, you have done a foolish thing, Samuel said. You have not kept the command the Lord your God gave you, If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's commandment. So a lot in this, right? So in essence, the judgment in this case for Saul not following God's plan was he would no longer be king. And not only would he no longer be king, none of his family, his family's line would no longer be king, i.e. Jonathan would ultimately never become king. He also talks about, a man after God's own heart. So I'm sure many of us have heard that term before, a man after God's own heart, is who God is seeking for kingship. And what does it mean to be a man after God's own heart? Well, it's simply someone who is subordinate to God, someone who 100% follows God's plans, and then when he misses, or when the king misses, essentially what it means is that you need to repent. You need to take ownership for your mishaps. And Saul was the antithesis of this. I mean, he did the exact opposite. He didn't subordinate himself to God. He didn't follow God's plans. And then when he messed up, he not only didn't repent or ask for forgiveness, he made a whole bunch of excuses. So a man after God's own heart is someone who does these three things. So as the story goes, now here we are. Now Jonathan, comes into the picture. He's the first prince. And if you think about it, like he had, at the time that his father was anointed king, he had this plan in place, right? He was going to be the next king. And I'm sure he's sort of mapping out, okay, when I become king, I'm going to do all of these things, i.e. his plan. And then Saul loses the kingdom because of his ineptness. And suddenly, Jonathan's plan he had in place to ultimately be the following king, that was gone. And Jonathan, per se, really by all rights, could have been really super frustrated. It's like, hey, it's not me, it's my father. Right? This time it's not you, it's not me. This time it's not me, it's my father. And yet I lose the right to become king. I mean, I didn't do anything wrong. And he could have taken a very negative attitude. But in the meantime, though, God had his eye on David, right? David is a youngster. This is right at the time when David is asked by God, as the Philistines were coming on him and he had Goliath, that all of the troops of Israel were afraid of. He goes to David, who was this 16-year-old, very meek guy. He had all the opposite in terms of appearances, in terms of the type of appearances that Saul had, which was, strong, masculine, very, had all the appearances. David was sort of the opposite. But what David had that Saul didn't have was he had sort of this inner strength of saying, when God said to David, I want you to go and I want you to take on this, Goliath guy, he didn't sort of stop and say, well, I can't do that. I mean, he put his faith in God, and with a slingshot and boom, a rock that hit, Goliath's forehead and knocked him down, showed that this was a man after God's own heart, right? That he relied on God, he had faith in God, and he followed his plan to the point of taking on, this monster. And as such, that is the one who would succeed Saul in the kingship. So Jonathan's stuck here in the middle of like, okay, now what? Well, the now what for Jonathan was, pretty incredible, right? So Jonathan losing his right to the kingship not only isn't frustrated, but he embraces this plan that God has of having David come in as the successor and the next king. And he embraces it to the point that he did everything possible to make sure that that would ultimately take place. Because as you can imagine, Saul, in learning about losing his kingship and knowing that David would be the future king, was naturally very jealous and very worried and very threatened by it, to the point where he wanted David killed. And as Jonathan learned about this and was even sort of defending, as Jonathan was defending himself to his father and saying, no, that's the wrong approach here, Saul then wanted to kill Jonathan, right? So Jonathan's role for the rest of the way, for the time that Saul was still alive, was to protect David. And protecting him is what he did. Because David was now a fugitive, relative to Saul, and he was on the run. And Jonathan, for the remainder of Saul's life, kept him out of harm's way and ensured that David remained alive. And again, we'd see that in 1 Samuel chapter 23, verse 17. where Jonathan says to David, don't be afraid, my father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king of Israel, and I will be second to you. Right, so this is amazing. So those two are very close friends. Jonathan saved David's life. Jonathan saved David's life in spite of what he lost from the shortcomings of Saul. And for those reasons and and real big reasons, that's why Jonathan is the unlikely hero of this Bible. So that's that. So we covered the first two sections here, and a really good timing. We've got 10 minutes left. Now, the important thing here, too, is that, as I take a quick breath, the important thing here now is that where do we go from here? So it's great. I mean, so I've really sort of emphasized and re-emphasized the point that following God's plan, to a T, is the way to go. Blessings will come, peace will come from following his plan. Judgment will come when you're not aligned with God's plan. So easy. So I want you to just go, and from this point forward, I want you to follow God's plan and not your own. Real simple, right? So it's anything but simple. And you say, okay, well, how do I know? I'm just a few clicks away from getting through this. Now I've just closed every garage door in Crystal Lake, so I think we're set. So following God's plan versus our own, that's... So again, how do we know that we're following God's plan? And how can we be much more intentional in following God's plan? Much easier said than done. You can say, okay, well, first of all, you naturally need to pray about it. And praying about it is absolutely important. You should always pray. If you're looking for some guidance, you should always pray about it. But I don't know about you, but when I'm looking for guidance, I mean, it's not as like God's like audibly saying, yeah, Dave, do this, don't do that. I can't believe you're doing this and not that sort of thing. It's not that simple. It doesn't come that easy. But I could say, from some personal experience, I don't necessarily always know that I'm following God's plan, or I don't know like precisely what God's plan is where I can intentionally follow it. But I can, in hindsight, know when God was working in my life, and I can, in hindsight, know when I followed God's plan versus followed my own plan, which, in hindsight. And that hindsight, I could use, just a simple example, by the fact that I'm up here today, even talking, raised in a Jewish home and talking to Christians and teaching Christianity. I never in a million years had this as part of my plans, especially like growing up in a Jewish home where the thought process is that, you will follow the religion, you will not go outside of the religion, you will not marry outside of the religion, you will not raise a family outside of the religion. That's sort of massively ingrained in terms of how you think, such that the plan was essentially written for me. So the fact that someday, I didn't sort of sit back like, when I was 15 years old, someday I want to learn about Christianity, become a Christian, and then, publicly speak and teach Christian people about this. So I know definitively that this here, which I've been doing here, for like 15, 20 years, this here didn't come from me. It could have only come from God. And the whole notion of like marrying outside of your religion didn't come from how I sort of planned my life, when I was younger, but love trumps this, right? You fall in love and that's it. And I fell in love with a Christian, a very faithful Christian, and we made the decision to raise our kids, in the Jewish religion, in the Christian religion, a slight slip, and then ultimately learned about Christianity, not with the intent of converting or following Christ, but after spending so many hours in learning about it, came to realize that Jesus Christ was this promised Messiah, and that it was a heavenly king, not an earthly king. And then ultimately, learned so much about this that I could have enough confidence, despite being petrified in terms of talking in front of people, to be able to share this, these stories with you. And I could tell you, like, the whole notion of like public speaking scared the heck out of me. And I got this like 10 years, and it's just sort of a quick story, 10 years before I ever started studying Christianity, and ever, had the notion that, all these things would happen, which have all been blessings. There's been nothing but blessings, which is absolutely another indicator that this is God's plan and not my own. But I was petrified of speaking. I had this audit job where I had to, at the end of the job, you had to in a round table, speak in front of, speak at people. And this is like only a dozen people at a table where you had to share your findings. And I was like, the night before I'd have to do that, I was always, so scared and so petrified. My manager finally said, hey, listen, Dave, there's a program that could get you over the nerves of speaking in front of people. And it's a Toastmaster program. I don't know if you've ever heard of Toastmasters, but it's a place where you could go and learn how to speak in front of people and speak publicly. And the first speech was a speech about yourself, right? So it's a 5-minute speech about yourself. So the night before, didn't sleep much. This 5-minute speech, I wrote it down word by word, right? So in case I forgot who I am, right? So I had this all written out, and got up there, went to the lectern. Now I grabbed a hold of this lectern. This lectern wasn't going to go anywhere, right? I had it. I had my grips on it, and I was heads down. And I said, hello, my name is David Eskoff. I'm so excited to be here today. I have a wife, 4 kids. I play golf. I like to make people laugh. I'm going to tell a funny joke now. This was so funny, I told it at a family gathering. My uncle laughed so loud, he passed gas. I was sorry, I told the joke. So that was kind of that's how the talk went. And then if everybody in that room would have walked out when it was doing it, I wouldn't have known. I was like this. But they all stood up. They didn't walk out of the room. They stood up. They clapped. One guy got up. He said, wow, Dave, that was really an inspiring speech. You've got a real future in public speaking. And that's how it went. So certainly, I mean, there was something that guy knew that I didn't know at the time. So the whole point is that I could look back and know where God has been working in my life, but it's very difficult to be super intentional on it. So that's the question right now. How can we know that God is working in our life? How can we be much more intentional to make sure that we're following God's plan and not our own? So I'm putting some thought into this, just one click away, is this. So I said, so sort of put together in my mind, what are some of the characteristics that know that we're following his plan and not our own? Well, the first characteristics is, could you have imagined coming up with this plan on your own, right? Certainly sort of fits into sort of my mindset, right? So if it's something that's way beyond something that you could have ever dreamed of, maybe a good chance that this is God's plan. The second thing that I thought about is this plan stretching you beyond your comfort zone? So it's so easy to do the things that we feel most comfortable with, but it's extremely difficult to do things that we're very uncomfortable with. And if you stretch and you go beyond that comfort zone and you do those things, there's a good chance that you're following someone else's plan, God's plan versus your own. And then the third point, super important, are the motives for your plan to meet the needs beyond your own. So if the plan that you're carrying out will have benefit beyond yourself, another good signal that this is probably God's plan and not your own. And then the fourth thing, which is certainly obvious, but does the plan please and glorify God? Right? Now, I wrote these are my 4 ideas, my four thoughts in terms of, like, how do you know you're following God's plan versus your own? There could be more, there could be fewer than this, I don't know, but this felt like a pretty good guide for me to know that, hey, these are the things that provide signals that you're following God's plan. And then ultimately, by doing that, you're going to be in a much better position to please and glorify God. The initial message, we end with that message. But thanks. That's it. So we're at the Q&A piece. That's not it, because I'm sure you guys have tons of questions. So. And actually feel free, feel comfortable to ask anything and ask nothing. Oh, here's a question.
You were talking about the kind of qualifications, if you will, about being a man after God's own heart,
Mm-hmm.
or a woman after God's own heart.
I had to be curious. I had to correct myself to you.
But
because it could be either.
Yeah, it kind of popped into my head then throughout like Kings and Chronicles when they're listing them, and it says so and so did good in the eyes of the Lord, or so and so did bad in the evil in the eyes of the Lord. Any thoughts or concepts on how those two connect? Because there were times it seems like some of those kings that did good in the eyes of the Lord, they ended not doing so good. But I don't know if that has any
no, I mean,
connection
that's a great question, right? Because, I mean, at the end of the day, first of all, again, this isn't what God didn't want this kingship thing the way that it turned out to be. And God warned them that this isn't going to work out. And the primary reason why it isn't going to work out is that kings are human like everyone else, right? And being human, there was the likelihood of sin. And the only way that, that ultimately you're doing what would be most pleasing to God is to wipe away sin, which is an impossibility by anybody. So, but there are points in time. I mean, it's not as though, you think about David. I mean, David did lots of really good things that were very pleasing to God, and he did lots of not so good things that were not pleasing to God. And he sort of fit the mold. But I think really in the bigger picture, at least the way that I see it, God let this play out, right? Because it provided much more proof points that, as much as you guys think, Jewish people, I mean, to this day still believe that it's going to be an earthly king versus a heavenly king. But you might think that this is what my plan is. That's not my plan, and this is not what's best for you. And you can't achieve this. I mean, sort of creating yourself equal to God doesn't work, and it fails all the time. But there are points that kings do good things, and then they ultimately do bad things, and then we move on to the next one. Good, yeah, good question.
So you were saying that in those 350 years, they would go through this cycle, and that 99% of that cycle was bad. So it was understandable from an earthly standpoint why these people would want to get out of that cycle and have a king. So, but if God had his way, what was he wanting? Was he wanting them to stay in that sort of cycle, or what was God's original intent? I know it's probably hard to say since that's not what happened.
Yeah, I love that question. I'm glad you raised it, right? I mean, the fact of the matter is that, sort of the cycle that existed, wasn't, so practically speaking, you could, I mean, the first part that I love is that practically speaking, you could really understand why the Jewish people wanted something different. They wanted they thought it was better, like, having an earthly king and they could bring peace. And it's practical that they thought that way, right? It's not an impractical thought. It was a very practical thought. And to your question, what God wanted that would have gotten him out of that cycle was, I mean, he was sort of sending the message that you sin and I judge. You sin and I judge, right? Stop sinning and I'll stop judging, right? And that's really wherever, that's where the peace would come from. He didn't want to break up that cycle. And even when he turned it over to kings, he didn't give up his power. He didn't give up his reigns to humans because he had the same expectations of the Jewish people when there was kings and before there were kings. So yeah, thanks. That was a great question. Anyone else? Any
others? There's one I wanted you to expand upon. It's your first question you have here. Given the lack of peace realized by the nation of Israel, and this dovetails that we just talked about, do the Jews' expectations for a coming Messiah seem practical and reasonable from a human perspective? And to elaborate on that is, you talked about Palm Sunday. Mm-hmm. And what was, and we've said this before, we've talked about it in Bible study. How could the Jews have not recognized their Messiah? How could the world have not recognized their Savior when Jesus arrived? So after this whole cycle, 1,000 years of having a king, and of course a period of that, they were very 400 to BC to the birth of Christ. It was kind of a mess, but you had a 600-700 year cycle where they were a kingdom, had a king, and there was so much, so many problems with surrounding nations with war, and they're waiting for the coming Messiah. But from a human perspective, you reference Palm Sunday. How do you contrast that from what they were looking for in an earthly king versus a heavenly king?
Yeah, so I mean, so even past judges, you move into kings, and essentially that cycle never stopped, right? I mean, because again, I mean, so in people's minds, in the Jewish people's minds, they thought that that cycle would stop because they had a king and not a judge, and that if you have the right king in there, peace would come. But it was the same people, same human beings making the same mistakes and the same judgments that would be passed. Now you've got Jesus that's entering, going to enter Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. How did the Jews miss? Well, because, for thousands of years, when you're sort of stuck on a point of view in terms of the way things are, it's really hard to unlock that. And quite frankly, although in Jesus' ministry, where he starts making references to the fact that we're talking about a heavenly king versus an earthly king, he was talking to a small group of people, and that still hadn't resonated. It takes many years, and if you think about it, the amount of time that's passed, since Jesus' death to now, where we started with 12 disciples to, the number, it's well over 1 billion, 2 billion Christians. It takes a while for the message to germinate. There wasn't social media, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't anything. So it's just a question of time. Now, why did the Jewish people, no different than, this is not even a picking on the Jewish people. Again, some of these questions already are really good because practically speaking, you could understand why the Jewish people wanted what they wanted, and why they thought that was going to be good. And I don't know that it was abundantly clear that God's message or plan to the Jewish people leading all the way up, prior to Christ, that this was about a heavenly king versus an earthly king. And quite frankly, 3 years into the ministry where Jesus is doing all these miraculous things, it's like, this is it. All these kings in the past, made mistakes. Well, Jesus had 3 years where he didn't make a single mistake, where he was not the least bit sinful, and he was performing these miracles. This is the guy that we're waiting for. But again, disappointment came when in fact he died on the cross, because that's not earthly in any way. So it's more of a practical thing, at least in my mind, in terms of why there's the miss. And then we all sort of get stuck in our points of view in terms of how things are and how things should be.
Okay, any other questions?
One quick statement, this format's fantastic, the content's fascinating, the energy you guys are bringing is great, so thank you.
Any thoughts about me, or? Well, you're on a roll. You were on a roll. I didn't want to stop. I wanted you to keep going. Right? Take it the full way. But thank you very much. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Scott. Appreciate that. Dave, will you close us in prayer, and then we will be done for the morning.
Dear God, thank you for bringing us all here together to study your word. Certainly the whole notion of following your plan versus our own, we appreciate your patience because we want to do things our way versus your way. But in the end, when we're following your plan, good things come. And, hopefully today's messages, today's words through you, will help inspire us to be more diligent in following your plan versus our own. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you. Have a good week.
We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark.
We took a march
We don't wrestle flesh and blood, but principalities of the dark. We two are marching to one beat, crushing the enemy under our feet. We are mighty in our stand, with God's word in our hand. Lord our God is a sword and shield. The Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Lord our God is a mighty tower. Lord our God is a sword and shield. Of faith. We are united in Jesus Christ. We are the soldiers of the light.
Test. Testing, testing, testing. This is a mic. Testing, testing.